My son moved into my house to help me. I let him. That was the plan. I'm having my morning coffee. Would you like some? The phone rang at 6:17 in the morning. I didn't recognize the number, but I picked up anyway. Mrs. Calloway, this is Special Agent Renee Aldrich, FBI Columbus Field Office. We need to speak with you about Stacy Pruitt Calloway and a federal fraud investigation currently underway across 3 states. Ma'am, are you the first person who reported this? I looked down at my coffee cup. My hands were completely still. Yes, I said, I believe I am. I had been waiting for that call for 6 months. My name is Margaret Calloway. Most people call me Meg. I am 74 years old and I live in Columbus, Ohio, in the same house I have lived in for 38 years. And what I am about to tell you is the story of how I nearly lost everything. Not to a stranger, not to some faceless criminal, but to the person I used to call my son. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments. And please stay with me until the end. I want to start somewhere that most people wouldn't think to start. Not with the betrayal, not with the lawyers or the courtroom or the FBI. I want to start on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1978 when Frank Calloway and I stood in an empty storefront on Parsons Avenue in Columbus with 2 gallons of white paint, a borrowed ladder, and roughly $12,000 between us that we had no business spending. The space smelled like old carpet and somebody else's cigarettes. The ceiling had a water stain shaped like the state of Florida. Frank looked at me and said, "You sure about this, Meg?" And I told him, "I've never been sure about anything in my life. Let's do it anyway." That was the beginning of Calloway's Hardware and Supply. We had no business plan that would impress anyone. What we had was 30 years of Frank watching his father run a construction company and 20 years of me watching my mother run a household on a budget so tight it squeaked. Frank knew lumber and pipe fittings and electrical conduit. I knew how to make a dollar stretch until it begged for mercy. Between the two of us, we figured we had enough to make something work. The first year was brutal. There were months we paid our suppliers before we paid ourselves. There were weeks I worked the register from 7 in the morning until 9 at night and came home to eat whatever was left in the fridge and fall asleep with my shoes still on. Frank did the deliveries himself in a truck that had no air conditioning and a driver's side window that wouldn't roll all the way up. In August, in Ohio. But we didn't quit. That was the thing about Frank and me. Neither one of us had ever learned how to quit. By year 3, we had 4 regular employees and a reputation in the neighborhood for being the place that actually had what you needed and didn't try to oversell you. Frank had a gift for that. He could talk to a homeowner who'd never held a wrench in his life and a licensed contractor with 30 years of experience and make both of them feel like they were being treated right. People trusted him, and because they trusted him, they kept coming back. I handled everything behind the counter: the books, the supplier negotiations, the inventory orders, the payroll. I fired our first employee in 1981, a young guy who was skimming small amounts from the register and thinking no one would notice. I noticed. I always noticed. Numbers don't lie. That's the one thing I will tell you with absolute certainty after 35 years of running a business. People lie all the time. Numbers only tell the truth. By the time our daughter Lori was born in 1983, the store was stable, not wealthy. Stable. We had 14 employees at our peak and a commercial account with 3 local contractors that kept the lights on even in the slow months. We weren't the kind of people who took vacations to Europe or drove fancy cars. We drove used trucks and took the kids camping in Michigan every summer and thought that was just about perfect. Derek came first in 1979. Lori 4 years later. They grew up in that store, both of them. Derek used to sit on the counter doing his homework on Saturday afternoons when he was maybe 9 or 10 years old, handing customers their change when I needed to step away. Lori organized the seasonal display every October with a seriousness that made the grown employees nervous. Frank used to joke that our kids were born knowing how to read a shelf label. That was the life we built, quietly, carefully, block by block, like anything built to last. Frank got his diagnosis in November of 2018. lung cancer, stage 3. He had never smoked a cigarette in his life, not one. The doctor who delivered the news looked genuinely uncomfortable, like he understood how unfair it was and couldn't find the right words to frame it. Frank sat in that chair with his hands folded in his lap and asked 2 questions. What are the options and what's the timeline? That was Frank. Straight to the practical. I sat beside him and held it together in the office and cried in the car on the way home, and then made dinner and didn't say anything until we were both at the kitchen table. And then I said, "We're going to fight this." Frank looked at me and said, "I know we are, but let's also be smart about it." Being smart about it meant making hard decisions fast. The store had been our life for 4 decades, but cancer treatment is consuming in a way that doesn't leave room for much else. We talked about it seriously for about 2 weeks, and then we called Bernie Kowalski, our CPA, the man who had handled our books since 1999 and knew our financial situation better than we did ourselves. Bernie walked us through the options with the kind of calm competence that you want from someone in his position. He advised us to sell. The timing was reasonable, the market was decent, and carrying the operational weight of a business while managing a serious illness was a risk neither of us needed to take. We listed Callaway's Hardware and Supply in early 2019. It sold by summer, $380,000. 40 years of work of early mornings and late nights and arguments over supplier contracts and laughing with employees at the Christmas party. Reduced to a wire transfer and a signature. Bernie put together a plan for the money. A significant portion went into certificates of deposit, 5-year terms, conservative interest rates. The rest sat in a high-yield savings account. Neither of us expected to need to touch it for a long time. Frank's insurance covered a substantial portion of treatment costs. Between the house, which had been paid off since 2009, and our retirement funds and the sale proceeds, we were secure. That word, secure. I held on to it like a railing in bad weather. Frank died on a Thursday morning in March of 2021. I was holding his hand. The nurse who came in to check on us was young, maybe 25, and she was very kind and very professional, and I could see it in her face, the specific way that people look when they are witnessing something they cannot fix. I thanked her. I remember doing that. Thanking her for something I can't even name now. I drove home alone. I walked into the kitchen, put the kettle on, and sat down at the table where Frank and I had eaten breakfast together for 40 years. And I just sat there. I didn't cry. I'd already done a lot of crying over the previous 2 years. What I felt in that moment was something quieter and harder to name, like the whole architecture of my daily life had just been quietly, permanently rearranged. The next 3 years, from 2021 to 2024, I will not pretend were easy. They were not. Living alone after 40 years of marriage is a specific kind of hard that nobody really prepares you for. Not the big moments, the small ones. Making coffee, for one. Watching something on TV and turning to say something funny about it and remembering there's no one there. Coming home to a house that doesn't change while you're out because no one else is in it. I kept myself busy as I always had. Ruth Ann Pickard, my closest friend of 40 years, came on Thursdays, and we'd have lunch somewhere and talk for 3 hours. I went to church on Sundays. I tended the garden, which Frank had started years ago, and which I had sworn to maintain because those roses were his pride, and I was not going to let them die just because he wasn't around to worry over them anymore. Lori called every single week from Portland without exception. She offered to come back to Columbus multiple times. I told her no. Her life was there, her husband, her kids. I was not going to be the reason she uprooted all of that. Derek called less often. That wasn't new. Derek had always been the one you had to reach for, the child who didn't reach back quite as naturally. I didn't take it personally. That was just his way. He'd married Stacy in 2015, a woman I had met at the wedding and seen perhaps a dozen times since. She was attractive and sharp and socially very smooth, the kind of person who always said exactly the right thing in any given situation. I had a feeling about her that I couldn't articulate. Not a bad feeling exactly. More like the feeling you get when a supplier quotes you a price that seems just a little too good. Something slightly off in the calibration. I pushed that feeling down. Derek seemed happy. That mattered more. In November of 2023, Derek and Stacy came for dinner. It was an ordinary evening. I made pot roast, which Frank had loved, and we sat at the kitchen table and talked about nothing in particular. Derek mentioned his logistics company, which he'd started in 2022, and said it was finding its footing, which I understood to mean it wasn't going great, but he didn't want to get into it. Stacy talked about the Columbus real estate market, which she knew inside and out, and described a few properties she'd been listing. She was good at making you feel like you were getting insider knowledge when she talked about her work, like she was letting you in on something. At some point in the conversation, I mentioned that the CDs Frank and I had put the sale money into were coming up on their 5-year maturity. Almost $300,000 sitting there, I said, not thinking anything of it. I keep meaning to call Bernie and figure out what to do with it. Maybe next month. I don't know exactly why I mentioned it. It wasn't a secret. It was just a fact of my financial life that happened to come up in conversation as those things do. I didn't think about it again that night. I found out later, much later, that before Stacy and Derek left my driveway, she had already sent a text message to someone in her contacts. I never found out who. What I know is what happened next. January of 2024, Derek called and asked if he and Stacy could move in for a while. "I'm worried about you, Mom," he said. "You're out there in that big house by yourself. It's not right. Let us come stay for a bit. We can help with things. I want to be honest with you about something. I know how this sounds in hindsight. I know what you're probably thinking. But I want you to understand what it feels like from the inside, because I don't think most people do until it happens to them." I was 73 years old. I had been living alone for 3 years. My husband was gone, my daughter was in another state, and my son was offering to come home. When you are lonely in that particular way, the offer of company doesn't come with warning labels. It just comes as relief. I said yes. They moved in the first week of February. Derek brought his laptop and set up in Frank's old study. Stacy rearranged the kitchen slightly, as people do in someone else's space, and I let her because it didn't matter to me where the dish towels were folded. She cooked dinner twice a week. She drove me to my doctor's appointment in March when my car was in the shop. She asked about Frank sometimes, in a way that seemed genuinely curious rather than performative. I started to think I'd been wrong about her. I started to think the feeling I'd had all those years was just the natural friction of two women who didn't know each other well enough yet. By March, she had earned enough of my trust to ask for something more. She offered to help me manage my bills online. "Those banking apps are kind of confusing," she said, sitting beside me at the table with my laptop open. "You shouldn't have to deal with all that. Just let me set it up and I'll take care of it." I told her that sounded fine. I had never particularly enjoyed the online banking interface anyway. Frank had always handled that part. I gave her my login information. In March, Derek sat down with me after dinner and said gently that he thought it was probably time for me to update my estate documents. "Your will is from 2015, Mom. A lot has changed since then. You should really have someone look at it, just to make sure everything's in order." He said he knew a lawyer through Stacy's professional network who did this kind of thing, estate planning for people in my situation. He said the guy was very good and very easy to work with. I thought about it for about 30 seconds and said that sounded reasonable. I was 74 years old with outdated documents and a trusting nature that I had not yet learned to apply more carefully to the people closest to me. And so it began. They had the paperwork, they had the access, and in April of 2024, they started using both. Howard Grell's office was on the 8th floor of a building on North High Street in downtown Columbus. Real elevator, real receptionist, real framed diplomas on the wall. I mention this because I want you to understand something important. The people who do what Howard Grelly did, what Stacy did, they don't always look like what you'd expect. They don't operate out of strip malls with flickering fluorescent lights. Sometimes they operate out of places that look entirely legitimate, because that's the whole point. The legitimacy is the trap. Stacy drove me to the first meeting in April. She sat beside me the entire time, which I did not think anything of at the time. Of course she came. She was family. She was helping. Grell was in his late 50s, silver-haired, the kind of man who had clearly been handsome in his younger years and had settled comfortably into the authority that comes with age. He greeted Stacy like he knew her, which he did. They'd crossed paths through the real estate world, but he kept it professional, didn't overdo the familiarity. That was deliberate, I understand now. Too much warmth between them would have looked like a setup. Just enough warmth looked like a coincidence. The first meeting was what he called a consultation. He asked me about Frank, about the store, about my current financial situation in broad strokes. He was a good listener. He nodded at the right times. He asked thoughtful follow-up questions. I left that meeting thinking he seemed competent and decent, which was exactly what I was supposed to think. The second meeting was in May. That was when the paperwork appeared. Grell set a folder on the desk in front of me, maybe 11 pages total, and walked me through it, section by section. There was an updated will, which made sense. There was a healthcare directive, which also made sense. And there was on page 4 a durable power of attorney designating Derek as my agent for financial matters. Grell described the POA the way you describe aspirin. Routine, harmless, something every responsible adult should have in place. This simply allows Derek to step in and help manage your finances in the event that you become unable to do so yourself, he said, sliding the page across the desk toward me. It's purely a protective measure. Most people your age have something like this already. Most people your age. He said it pleasantly enough, but I caught the implication underneath it. You are old enough that this is just common sense. Don't overthink it. I want to be straight with you about what happened next because I think it's important. I did not read every line of that document carefully. I skimmed it. I asked a few questions. Grell answered them in plain language that matched what I was seeing on the surface of the page, but did not reflect what the document actually said in its specific legal language. The phrase he used was, "if you become incapacitated." The phrase in the actual document was at agent's sole discretion. Those two things are not the same. One means Derek could act on my behalf if I had a stroke or developed dementia. The other means Derek could act on my behalf whenever he decided he wanted to. I did not catch that distinction. I was not a lawyer. I was a 74-year-old woman who had spent 40 years reading supplier contracts and payroll forms, not estate documents. And I was sitting next to my son, who was nodding reassuringly, and across from a man with a law degree and a nice office who was telling me this was all perfectly standard. So I signed. And just like that, with a ballpoint pen on a Tuesday afternoon in May, I handed Derek Calloway, and by extension Stacy Pruitt Calloway, legal authority over my financial life. The CDs matured in April, right around the time of that first meeting with Grell. I had mentioned it to Bernie in passing and told him I'd call to discuss reinvestment options once I had the estate documents updated. I never made that call. Life got busy as it tends to do, and the money sat in my primary savings account, liquid and accessible, while I dealt with everything else. $290,000. Sitting there. I think about that timing now. I think about the fact that Stacy heard me mention the maturity date in November of 2023, and the first meeting with Grella happened in April of 2024, the same month the money became available. I do not believe that was a coincidence. I believe that was a schedule. By June, Stacy had everything she needed. She began with what I would later learn is a classic move in elder financial exploitation cases. She did not simply take the money. That would have been detectable too quickly. Instead, she built a structure that made the movement of money look like something other than theft. She used Derek's power of attorney to transfer $95,000 from my savings account into an LLC she controlled, a limited liability company registered with the Ohio Secretary of State under a business name that sounded vaguely like an investment firm. The stated purpose of the transfer, as documented in her own records, was real estate investment on behalf of Margaret Calloway. The LAC then purchased a piece of land in the suburban outskirts of Columbus, a parcel at 1147 Birchwood Drive. The deed listed Meg Calloway as 30% owner and Stacy's LLC as 70% owner. I did not know this property existed. I had never heard the address. No one told me I now owned a piece of land on the east side of the city. In July, the LLC sold the property for $147,000. Stacy's 70% share was approximately $102,900. My 30% share, theoretically $44,100, went directly back into the LLC account. It never touched my hands. Meanwhile, Stacy used an additional $38,000 from my account, again authorized through Derek's POA, to pay down the outstanding debt on Derek's logistics company. This was recorded in her documentation as a family loan. There was no promissory note. There was no repayment schedule. There was just a transfer out of my account and into an account Derek controlled. Total money moved out of my life by August of 2024, $133,000. They had dinner with me 3 or 4 nights a week the whole time this was happening. Derek asked how I was sleeping. Stacy made her chicken casserole, the one I had told her once that I liked. We watched the news together in the evenings and talked about the weather and whether the garden needed more mulch. That is the part that still gets me, not the money, the dinners. In September, I got a letter from the IRS. I almost didn't open it the same day. I had a habit of leaving government mail on the counter for a day or two before dealing with it, the way you put off any task that you know will require your full attention. But something made me open it that evening. Standing at the counter with my reading glasses still on from the crossword puzzle I'd been doing. The letter informed me that I had a federal tax obligation related to capital gains from the sale of real property. The property in question was listed as 1147 Birchwood Drive, Columbus, Ohio. The estimated tax owed was $11,200. I read it once. Then I took off my glasses, set them on the counter, and read it again. I had not bought any property. I had not sold any property. I had not heard of 1147 Birchwood Drive in my life. And yet here was the Internal Revenue Service of the United States federal government informing me that I owed them $11,200 in taxes on a real estate transaction conducted in my name. I stood in that kitchen for a long time. I want to tell you that I had some immediate flash of clarity in that moment, some dramatic realization where everything snapped into focus. That is not what happened. What happened was slower and quieter, and in some ways harder to describe. It was more like something settling. Like a feeling I had been carrying for months without naming it had just been handed a label. I folded the letter and put it in the kitchen drawer, the one where I kept things I needed to deal with, but wasn't ready to deal with yet. I went to bed at my usual time. I did not sleep. The next morning, I made coffee and sat down at the table while Derek and Stacy were still asleep, and I began very methodically to think. That was day 1. Day 2, I waited until the house was empty. Derek had a meeting somewhere. Stacy was showing properties. I went into Frank's old study, which they had been using as a home office, and I looked through the files on the desk until I found the folder from Howard Grella's office. I sat down and read every single page. I read slowly. I read the way I used to read supplier contracts back in the store, underlining things in my head, flagging language that didn't match what I'd been told verbally. And on page 4, in the section outlining the scope of authority granted under the durable power of attorney, I found the language that Grelli had glossed over in his office. At agent's sole discretion, not if I became incapacitated, not if a doctor certified I was unable to manage my own affairs. At Derek's sole discretion, meaning whenever he or whoever was directing him decided to act. I sat with that for a minute. Then I put the folder back exactly where I had found it, walked back to the kitchen, and picked up my phone. "Bernie," I said, "I need to see you. Not at your office, at your house, and I need you to not mention this to anyone." There was a pause on the other end. Bernie had known me for 25 years. He understood from my tone that this was not a casual request. "I'll be home all afternoon," he said. "Come whenever you're ready." Bernie's kitchen table had seen a lot of my business decisions over the years. We had spread invoices and tax returns across it more times than either of us could count. That afternoon, I set down the IRS letter, the POA document, and a printout of my savings account statement that I had pulled up on Fonvote and photographed before leaving the house. Bernie put on his reading glasses and went quiet for a long time. He made 2 phone calls while I sat there. The first was to someone he knew at the Franklin County Recorder's office, who confirmed the property record at 1147 Birchwood Drive, the ownership split, and the sale date. The second was to a contact at a title company who could pull the deed history quickly. By the time he hung up from the second call, we had a complete picture. Meg, he said, and then he stopped and started again. This was done through Derek's power of attorney. Every transaction has his authorization on it, but none of it benefited you. The land was bought in your name as a minority owner and sold before you knew it existed. The tax liability was left with you. The profit went to the LLC. How much? I said. The direct transfers total $133,000, he said, give or take. I nodded. I had been running numbers in my head the night before, and I had already arrived somewhere close to that figure. Hearing it said out loud by someone else was different, though. It landed differently. Bernie, I said, I need you to tell me something honestly. Is there any interpretation of any of this that isn't what it looks like? He took off his glasses. He set them on the table. No, he said, there isn't. I drove home. I made dinner. Derek said it smelled great. Stacy asked if I'd seen anything good on TV lately. I said I'd been watching a documentary series, which was a lie, and I described a show that didn't exist, and neither of them questioned it. That night, after they went to bed, I sat in the dark in the living room for a long time and thought about what I was going to do next. I was not going to confront them. I understood instinctively that confrontation was the wrong move. In 35 years of business, I had learned that you do not show your hand until you are ready to play it. I was not ready yet. What I needed was more information, and I needed to know if this was bigger than just me. The next evening, I did something I almost never do. I opened my laptop and started searching. I typed Stacy Pruitt Calloway into the search bar and scrolled through the results, her real estate listings, her LinkedIn profile, a mention in a Columbus Business First article from 2021. Nothing that told me much I didn't already know. Then I searched Elder Financial Fraud Columbus, Ohio's real estate, and one of the first results that came up was an article from the Columbus Dispatch, published in June of 2024, 3 months before I received the IRS letter. The author was Carol Simmons. The headline read, Elder Financial Fraud, Ohio's Growing Crisis in Real Estate Transactions. I read the whole thing twice. The article described a pattern that investigators and elder law attorneys in Franklin County had been tracking for several years. The method was consistent across multiple cases. A trusted person, often a family member or caregiver, obtains power of attorney over an elderly person's finances. They then use that authority to move money through real estate transactions structured as investments. The elderly person is sometimes listed as a partial owner of properties they don't know exist. The transactions generate tax liabilities in the elderly person's name. The profits disappear into accounts the elderly person never sees. Stacy Pruitt Calloway was not named in the article, but the method described was the method she had used on me with a precision that made the hair on my arms stand up. At the bottom of the article was Carol Simmons' email address and a note that said she welcomed tips from readers who had relevant information to share. I sat back in my chair. I remembered Carol Simmons. In 2009, she had come into the store on a slow Wednesday and spent about an hour talking to Franken for a piece she was writing about longtime local businesses on the South Side. The article ran on a Sunday, maybe 200 words, a small thing, but she had been thoughtful about it. She had asked real questions and listened to the answers. Frank had liked her. I still had that newspaper. It was in a box in the hall closet with other things I had kept, because Frank would have wanted me to. I picked up my phone and called the dispatch main number. When the operator answered, I asked to be connected to Carol Simmons in the newsroom. It was late in the day. I half expected to get voicemail. She picked up on the second ring. Miss Simmons, I said, my name is Margaret Calloway. You wrote about my hardware store 15 years ago, and you probably don't remember me. but I've just read your article about elder financial fraud in Columbus, and I think what happened to me might be exactly what you've been looking for." There was a brief silence on the other end. Then Carol Simmons said, "Mrs. Calloway, I'm very glad you called. Can you come in tomorrow?" I drove to the dispatch building the next morning. What happened in the next hour would change everything, not just for me, but for 11 other people I had never met. Carol Simmons was not what I expected, though I am not sure what exactly I had expected. She was maybe 40 practical looking, the kind of woman who dressed for function rather than impression. She met me in the lobby of the dispatch building on a Wednesday morning and shook my hand with a firmness that I appreciated. She did not treat me like a fragile elderly woman who needed to be handled carefully. She treated me like a source, which is what I was, and which was exactly what I needed. She had reserved a small conference room. Just the two of us, a table, two chairs, a legal pad in front of her, and a recorder she set down and asked my permission to use before she turned it on. I said yes. I had nothing to hide, and I wanted everything documented. I talked for nearly an hour without stopping. I told her about the dinner in November where I mentioned the CDs. I told her about Derek and Stacy moving in, about the online banking access I had handed over without thinking twice, about Howard Grell and his 8th floor office, and the 11-page folder, and the phrase at agent's sole discretion buried in the middle of page 4, where I had not thought to look closely enough. I told her about the IRS letter and the 3 days I had spent in silence, running numbers in my head, reading documents alone in Frank's old study, while my son and his wife slept down the hall. I told her about Bernie's table and the $133,000 and the look on Bernie's face when he took off his glasses and set them down and told me no, there was no other interpretation. Carol wrote steadily the whole time. She asked questions, but they were precise questions, not the kind that interrupt the flow of a story, more like the kind that sharpen it. She wanted dates, she wanted amounts, she wanted the exact language from the POA document, which I had photographed on my phone and which I pulled up for her right there at the table. When I finished, she set her pen down. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "I have been working on a piece about elder financial fraud in Franklin County for almost 8 months. I have spoken to investigators, to elder law attorneys, to bank officials, to adult protective services caseworkers. I have 3 confirmed cases I have been tracking. Your situation matches the pattern so closely that I want to be very careful here, because I do not want to get ahead of the evidence." She paused. "But I will tell you this. The name Stacy Pruitt has come up in my reporting twice in the last 6 months, from 2 different sources. I have not been able to confirm enough to print it until now." I looked at her across the table. "She has done this before," I said. It was not a question. Carol looked at me steadily. "That is what I am working to confirm," she said, "and what you have just given me may be the piece I have been missing." We talked for another 30 minutes about next steps. Carol was clear that she could not publish anything without independent corroboration and editorial review, that the process would take time, and that she needed me to be patient. She was also clear about something else. "Before you do anything legally," she said, "I want you to talk to someone. There is an attorney in Columbus who handles exactly these cases. Her name is Janet Okafor. She is very good. Will you let me make a call?" I told her yes. I met Janet Okafor 2 days later on a Friday afternoon at her office on East Broad Street. The office was small, 3 attorneys total, a modest waiting room with sensible furniture and a bookshelf full of legal texts that looked genuinely read rather than decoratively arranged. Janet herself was probably 50, with close-cropped, natural hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck, and the specific kind of calm that comes not from indifference, but from having seen enough hard situations to know that panic does not improve any of them. She listened to my entire story without interrupting, taking her own notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, reviewing what she had written, and then she looked up. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "what has been done to you has a specific legal name. It is called financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and under the Ohio Revised Code, specifically Section 29.302, it is a criminal offense, not just a civil matter." You also have a strong civil case for breach of fiduciary duty and fraudulent misuse of a power of attorney. The question is not whether you have a case. The question is how we build it so that it is airtight. She explained the process. Her team would subpoena bank records from the relevant financial institutions, which would take approximately 3 weeks under Ohio civil procedure. They would pull the property records from the Franklin County Recorder's Office, the LLC registration documents from the Ohio Secretary of State, and the transaction history of every account that had received funds originating from mine. They would also arrange for me to be examined by my own physician, someone entirely independent of Derek or Stacy, to document my full cognitive competency, because one of the defenses commonly used in these cases is that the elderly person was confused or incapacitated and the agent was acting appropriately. We needed to close that door before anyone tried to walk through it. I need to ask you something directly, Janet said. Derek and Stacy are currently living in your home. Are you able to continue living with them and giving no indication that anything has changed? Because if they suspect you are building a case against them, they may attempt to move assets, destroy documents, or pressure you in ways that complicate the legal process significantly. I thought about 35 years of business, about the contracts I had negotiated without ever letting the other party know my bottom line, about the employee I had fired in 1981, the one skimming from the register, and how I had spent 2 weeks documenting everything carefully before I said a single word to him about it. Yes, I said, I can do that. Janet almost smiled. Good, she said. My retainer is $6,500. I want to be honest with you about what this process involves. It will take 6 to 8 months. There will be moments when it feels like nothing is happening, but I will not file until we have everything we need, and when we do file, we will do it in a way they cannot recover from. I wrote the check that afternoon. The 7 weeks that followed were the strangest of my life. On the surface, nothing changed. I made coffee every morning. I weeded the garden on weekends. Ruth Ann came for lunch on Thursdays. I went to church on Sundays and sat in the same pew I had sat in for 30 years and listened to sermons about patience and trust, which felt, under the circumstances, either cruelly ironic or precisely appropriate depending on the hour of the day. Derek and Stacy were still there, still eating dinner at my table, still asking how I was sleeping, whether my knee was bothering me, whether I needed anything from the grocery store. Stacy made her chicken casserole again in October. I told her it was delicious. Underneath the surface, everything was moving. Janet's team filed the subpoenas and began the slow, methodical work of assembling the financial record. Carol and her colleagues at the Dispatch were running their own parallel investigation, cross-referencing the information I had given Carol with what they already had, reaching out to sources in the real estate and legal communities, pulling public records on Stacy's LLC and its transaction history. I did not know most of the details of what either team was doing in real time. Janet kept me informed at a high level, enough to know the process was progressing. Not so much that I was sitting with information that might change my behavior at home in ways Stacy might notice. That was deliberate. Janet was very careful about that. What I did at home was watch, not in any obvious way. I did not go through their things or eavesdrop on phone calls or do anything that could later be characterized as suspicious behavior on my part. I simply paid attention in a way that 40 years of running a business teaches you to pay attention, quietly, continuously, storing information without reacting to it. I noticed that Stacy was on her phone a great deal more than usual, stepping outside to take calls in the backyard in a way she had not done in the spring and summer. I noticed that Derek seemed tense in a way he was working hard to conceal, that he laughed a little too easily at dinner, the way people do when they are performing relaxation rather than feeling it. I noticed that twice in October, Stacy drove somewhere in the afternoon and did not say where she was going, which was unusual because she had always been very forthcoming about her schedule, in that particular way of people who want you to believe they have nothing to hide. I stored all of it. I said nothing. In the 5th week of the preparation period, something shifted. Janet had, without notifying Derek or Stacy, contacted my bank and Said that an additional verification step be added to any transfers above a certain threshold in my accounts. This was entirely within her legal authority to request on my behalf and required no notification to the holder of the power of attorney. It was a protective measure, quiet and surgical. One of Stacy's pending transactions was flagged and declined. I did not know this had happened until Derek knocked on my bedroom door at 9:30 on a Tuesday night. He sat down in the chair across from me, the one by the window where Frank used to read, and he looked at his hands for a long moment before he looked at me. He seemed tired in a way that went beyond just the hour. There were things in his face that night that I had not seen there before, or maybe had not let myself see. Something strained around the eyes, something that looked, if I am being honest, a little like shame. "Mom," he said, "I need to tell you something about the business situation." I kept my expression neutral, open, the face of a mother, waiting to hear whatever her son needs to say. "Things have been harder than I let on," he said. "The logistics company has been struggling. I should have told you sooner. I just didn't want you to worry." I asked him how bad it was. He said it was pretty bad. He used the word debt several times without specifying an amount. He did not mention Stacy. He did not mention the LLC or the Birchwood Drive property or the $133,000. He talked around the edges of the thing without ever naming the thing itself. When he was finished, I reached over and put my hand on his, and I told him that I appreciated him being honest with me and that we would figure things out together as a family and that he should try to get some sleep. He nodded and said goodnight and pulled the door closed behind him. I sat in the dark after he left and I did not sleep for a very long time. Because here is the thing I have not told anyone, not Janet, not Carol, not even Ruth Ann. Sitting there that night, listening to Derek's footsteps go down the hall, I was not angry at my son. What I felt was something more complicated and in some ways harder to carry than anger. I felt grief. The same quiet, rearranging grief I had felt in the kitchen the morning Frank died, the sense that something fundamental had shifted and could not be shifted back. He was a man I had raised from the day he was born, a man I had loved his entire life, and somewhere along the way, for reasons I was still trying to understand, he had let something terrible happen to me. Maybe he had told himself it was temporary. Maybe he had told himself I would never find out. Maybe Stacy had convinced him of the he should never have let himself be convinced of. I did not know yet how much he knew, how much he had understood about what was being done, and that uncertainty was its own particular kind of pain. From the room down the hall, I could hear the low murmur of voices, Derek and Stacy talking. I could not make out the words, just the cadence. Derek's voice low and uncertain, Stacy's voice sharper, more insistent, the conversation going on longer than it should have if everything was fine. I got up and made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table in the same chair where I had sat the morning I got the IRS letter, and I thought about Frank. I thought about what he would say if he could see what was happening in this house. Frank was not a complicated man emotionally. He believed in honesty and fairness, and the idea that how you treat people is the truest thing about you. He would not have been uncertain about what needed to happen here. I was not uncertain either. I just needed a little more time. The call from Carol came in the 6th week, on a Thursday afternoon while I was at lunch with Ruth Ann. I excused myself and stepped outside the diner to take it. It was cold, one of those sharp late October days in Ohio when the sky is perfectly clear and the air has a bite to it that reminds you winter is serious business here and has been every year since before you were born. Carol's voice was calm and measured as it always was, but I had been talking to her long enough by that point to hear the thing underneath the calm. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "I need to tell you something we found. I want you to hear it from me directly before it appears anywhere in print." I pulled my coat a little tighter and told her to go ahead. "Our reporting has turned up a prior case," Carol said, "before Stacy married Derek. In 2019, a woman named Ruth Abernathy, 79 years old, living in Westerville, experienced a nearly identical situation. Power of attorney obtained through a third-party attorney, real estate LLC, property transactions in her name, funds that disappeared. Ruth Abernethy lost approximately $67,000. I said nothing. I watched a car pull out of the diner parking lot. Mrs. Abernethy passed away in 2021, Carol continued. Her family had filed a civil complaint but withdrew it after her death. The case was never prosecuted, which means Stacy Pruitt has done this before and she got away with it, and then she married your son and she did it again. I stood on the sidewalk outside the diner for a long moment after Carol finished speaking. A woman I had never met, 17 to 9 years old, in a town 20 miles up the road, had lost $67,000 who had taken $133,000 from me. That woman had died before she got any justice. Her family had given up. I thought about Ruth Abernethy the whole drive home. I thought about how she had probably trusted someone too, how she had probably not seen it coming either, how she had probably lain awake some night as I had, running numbers, reading documents, trying to make sense of something that made no decent sense at all. I thought about whether Derek had known about Ruth Abernethy, whether he had known what Stacy was before he brought her into his life, before he brought her into mine. And I thought about the fact that I still did not have the answer to that question, and that the answer mattered enormously, not in the legal case, but in the question of who my son was, and whether the person I thought I had raised still existed somewhere inside the man who had knocked on my bedroom door the week before and talked around the edges of the truth. I pulled into the driveway. I sat in the car for a few minutes before going inside. Then I went in and started dinner and did not say a word. Week 7. Janet said we were ready. Carol said she was ready. And on the morning of November 18th, so was I. The night before the article, I did not sleep. Not because I was afraid. I want to be clear about that. I had passed through afraid somewhere around week 3 of the preparation period and come out the other side into something quieter and more permanent. What kept me awake that Sunday night was not fear, but a kind of heightened stillness, the feeling you get before something you have been building toward for a long time finally arrives. Like the night before a closing on a major contract, like the morning of a day you know will be different from every day that came before it. I got up at 5 and made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark and drank it slowly and thought about Frank. Not with sadness exactly. More with the feeling of wanting someone beside you when something important is about to happen. Wanting to turn to someone and say, "Are you ready?" and have them say, "Yeah, let's go." At 6 o'clock, I opened my laptop and navigated to the Columbus Dispatch website. Carol's article was at the top of the page. The headline read, "Real estate agent exploited 3 Columbus seniors, sources say. Formal legal action now underway in Franklin County." I read it carefully from beginning to end. Carol had done what good journalists do, which is tell the truth with enough precision that no one can reasonably dispute the facts and enough humanity that the facts land the way they should. She described the pattern. She named Stacy Pruitt Calloway in the 3rd paragraph. She referenced the case of Ruth Abernethy in Westerville without identifying her by name, describing her as a deceased Westerville resident whose family had filed and withdrawn a civil complaint in 2021. She quoted an elder law attorney and a Franklin County investigator without naming either of them. She did not quote me directly. We had agreed on that. My name would come later, in the courtroom where it belonged. I closed the laptop. I refilled my coffee. The house was still quiet. At 6:17, my phone rang. Stacy. I watched it ring and did not pick up. It rang again 40 seconds later. Derek this time. Then Stacy again. By 6:45, I had received 11 calls and a series of text messages that I read without responding to. The first few were confused. "What is this article? Call me. We need to talk right now." Then they shifted. "Mom, please answer. This is not what it looks like." Then the tone shifted again into something that was trying to sound like indignation, but underneath it was unmistakably something else. Something that sounded, if you have ever heard it before, exactly like panic. I heard footsteps in the hallway. Then the kitchen door opened and Stacy walked in. She was still in her pajamas, which I had never seen before, because she was always dressed by the time I came downstairs. Her hair was loose, and her face had that particular unguarded quality that faces get when the performance has not had time to get started yet. She was holding her phone with both hands, the screen facing me, the article visible on it. She looked at me across the kitchen. For the first time in nearly a year of living together, neither of us was pretending. "What did you do?" she said. Her voice was low, and it was not entirely steady. I picked up my coffee cup. I looked at her over the rim of it. "I'm having my morning coffee," I said. "Would you like some?" She stared at me for a long moment, and then something moved across her face that I had never seen there before in all the months of dinners and casseroles and careful performances of warmth and concern. It was the specific look of a person who has just understood that they fundamentally misjudged the person standing across from them. She went back down the hallway without saying another word. I finished my coffee. Then I went upstairs and put on my best clothes, not my funeral clothes, not the navy dress I had worn to Frank's service. I put on the gray wool suit I had bought for a business presentation in 2014, the one with the good structure to the shoulders, and my pearl earrings and my low-heeled shoes. And I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a moment and looked at myself. I looked like what I was, a woman who had built something and defended it and was not finished yet. The emergency petition Janet had filed with the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas was scheduled for a hearing in December, 3 weeks after the articles ran. Judge Harold Weston presided. He was in his mid-60s, deliberate in his manner, the kind of judge who reads everything in front of him carefully and asks questions that reveal he has already thought about the answers. I want to describe this courtroom moment accurately, which means I want to describe it the way it actually happened, rather than the way it would happen in a movie. There was no dramatic speech from me. Janet had prepared an affidavit, 4 pages, which I had written myself over 3 evenings at the kitchen table after Derek and Stacy had gone to bed. Every transaction, every date, every conversation I could document, written out in plain language in my own hand. Janet read from it in court. My voice was in every sentence of it. That was enough. What I did not expect, what Janet had told me was possible, but what I had not fully allowed myself to believe until I saw it with my own eyes, was Derek. He walked into that courtroom as a witness for my side. He had contacted Janet 10 days before the hearing. I did not know until Janet told me, and even then I did not know exactly what to feel about it. Derek had sat across from Janet and told her everything he knew, which was more than I had given him credit for knowing, and less than I had feared. He had known about the Birchwood Drive transaction. Stacy had presented it to him as a legitimate investment opportunity for me, a way to grow my money while it was sitting idle. He had signed off on it because Stacy told him it was legal and beneficial, and he had wanted to believe her because believing her was easier than the alternative. He had not known about Ruth Abernethy. When Carol's article ran and he read the description of the prior case, the 79-year-old woman in Westerville, the identical method, the family that had given up withdrawn the complaint, Derek had sat alone in the bedroom for a long time. Then he had picked up his phone and called Janet Okafor's office. I watched him take the stand. He was wearing a dark suit I had not seen before, recently pressed. He looked like what he was, a man in his mid-40s who had made a serious mistake and was trying to do the one right thing that remained available to him. His voice was steady. He answered every question Janet asked him directly and without deflection. He confirmed the transactions. He confirmed that Stacy had directed them. He confirmed that he had signed authorizations without fully understanding what he was authorizing. He confirmed that no one had ever discussed with him how any of this money was supposed to benefit me. Stacy's attorney objected several times. Judge Weston overruled every objection with a patience that made clear he had already formed a view of the situation. At one point, Judge Weston looked directly at the documentation spread before him and said, in the measured tone of a man who selects his words carefully, "The record here does not show a single transaction that can be reasonably characterized as serving the interests of Mrs. Calloway. Not one." He looked up. "Counsel, I want you to show me one." Stacy's attorney could not show him one. The ruling came from the bench that same afternoon. The durable power of attorney granted to Derek Calloway was immediately and permanently revoked. All accounts that had received transfers originating from Margaret Calloway's accounts, were frozen pending a complete forensic accounting. Stacy Pruitt Calloway was ordered not to leave the state of Ohio. Both Derek and Stacy were ordered to appear for depositions within 30 days. Judge Preston also noted, in language that Janet later described to me as unusually direct for a civil proceeding, that he was referring the matter to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office for review under Ohio's elder abuse statutes. I sat in that courtroom and listened to all of it with my hands folded in my lap and my back straight, and I did not cry. I had done my crying. What I felt in that moment was something I do not have a perfect word for. Quiet, I think, is the closest I can get. A very deep quiet, like the moment after a storm, when the air is completely still and you can hear individual things again. Outside the courthouse afterward, Stacy tried to approach me. Her attorney stepped forward and said something to her in a low voice. Derek was standing 15 feet away with his own attorney, and he looked at me across that distance with an expression I will not try to describe because I do not think I have the right words for it, and I am not sure I want to find them. I got into Janet's car, we drove away, and then on a Monday morning 6 days after the court ruling, at 6:17 in the morning, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. I picked up. Mrs. Calloway? This is Special Agent Renee Aldrich, FBI Columbus Field Office. We need to speak with you about Stacy Pruitt Calloway and a federal fraud investigation currently underway across 3 states. Ma'am, are you the first person who reported this? I looked down at my coffee cup. My hands were completely still. That was the moment I told you about at the very beginning of this story. Now you know how I got there. Janet told me later that the FBI had been watching the case since Carol's article ran in November. They were waiting to see whether the civil proceeding would hold before they moved. The court ruling 6 days earlier had been the confirmation they needed. What Agent Aldrich told me in the next 20 minutes was this. Stacy Pruitt Calloway's LLC had been flagged by a financial crimes unit in Indiana 8 months earlier as part of a broader pattern investigation. The same method, the same structure, different states. Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky. At least 11 elderly individuals across those 3 states had been identified as victims. Total estimated losses exceeded $890,000. My case was the first one in which a victim had come forward with complete documentation early enough and clearly enough to give investigators what they needed to move. Without what I had given Janet, without what Janet had built into a formal legal record, without what Carol had published in the Dispatch that set the whole thing in motion, the federal case might have taken another 2 years to develop. I was not the only one, but I was the one who made it possible to stop it. The legal process from that point forward took several more months, which I will not walk you through in exhaustive detail because the details are less important than the outcome, and the outcome is this. In March of 2025, Stacy Pruitt Calloway entered a plea agreement on federal charges of wire fraud and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. She received 4 years of supervised probation. She permanently lost her real estate license in Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. She was ordered to make full restitution. The civil judgment in my case required her to return the $133,000 she had taken, plus $47,000 in civil damages, interest, and penalties. Total, $180,000 to be paid to me over 24 months. Howard Grella was the subject of a formal bar complaint filed with the Ohio State Bar Association. That process, I was told, would take 18 to 24 months. I do not know yet what will come of it. What I know is that the complaint is on record and the record will follow him. Derek was not criminally charged. His cooperation had been full and unequivocal, and the prosecutor's office determined that his culpability, while real, did not rise to the level of criminal conduct in the way Stacy's did. Whether that is the right call is not for me to say. What I can tell you is that the decision was not mine, and I did not try to influence it in either direction. What happened to Derek personally is harder to summarize than what happened legally. He and Stacy separated within weeks of the court hearing and filed for divorce by February. He lost the house, which had been in Stacy's name. He closed the logistics company, which had been failing anyway. He moved into a one-bedroom apartment on the east side of Columbus, not far, as it happens, from a piece of land on Birchwood Drive that had once briefly been listed in my name without my knowledge. We talked, Derek and I, not the way we used to, which, if I am being honest, was never as much as I would have liked. But we talk, phone calls mostly. A dinner at a restaurant every few weeks. Somewhere neutral, not at my house. There are things between us that have not been resolved, and may not be for a long time, and may never be entirely. I have made my peace with that uncertainty in the way you make peace with things you cannot change, by deciding that you can hold them without being destroyed by them. Lori flew in from Portland the week after the court hearing and stayed for 3 weeks. We repainted the room Derek and Stacy had been using. We bought new curtains. We rearranged the furniture the way I wanted it, not the way it had been arranged when they were there. Lori cried more than I did, which I think is because she had been carrying her own fear and guilt about not being here, about being 3,000 miles away while all of this was happening, and she needed to let that out somewhere. I let her. That is what mothers are for. The money, all of it, is in a trust now. Janet drafted the documents, and Bernie helped structure it properly. The trust has 3 trustees, Janet, Bernie, and Lori, and it requires agreement from at least 2 of them for any significant financial decision. There is no power of attorney for any individual. There will not be again, not because I do not trust people, but because I have learned something important about trust, which is that it works best when it is not the only protection you have. I still live on Brentnell Avenue. I still have coffee on the front porch in the mornings when the weather allows. Frank's roses came back strong this spring, which I take as nothing in particular and also as everything. I still meet Ruth Ann for lunch on Thursdays. I still go to church on Sundays. I joined the Columbus Elder Advocacy Network in January, a nonprofit that helps older adults recognize the warning signs of financial exploitation. Carol introduced me to the people who run it. I go to their community sessions once a month and I talk to people, sometimes large groups and sometimes just 1 or 2 individuals who have found their way there because something has happened or they are afraid something is about to happen. And I tell them what I know. I tell them that the people who do these things are not always strangers. I tell them that love and exploitation are not mutually exclusive, that someone can genuinely care about you and also be willing to take from you, and that recognizing that fact is not cynicism. It is just the truth. I tell them to read every document before they sign it, to take every document home before they sign it, to have someone who is not connected to the person presenting the document review it before they sign it. I tell them that the language buried in the middle of page 4 of an 11-page document is often more important than everything on page 1. And I tell them what I am going to tell you now. There is one thing I never said out loud to anyone during all of this. Not to Janet, not to Carol, not to Ruth Ann, not even to Lori. The night before the court hearing, I sat at the kitchen table where Frank and I had eaten breakfast together for 40 years. The house was quiet. Derek had moved out by then, and the silence of that house was one I had grown into again and made my own, the way you reclaim a space that has been occupied by something other than yourself. I did not think about the $133,000. I did not think about Stacy or Howard Grell or Judge Weston or the federal investigation or any of it. I thought about a morning in the spring of 1978 when Frank and I stood in an empty storefront on Men's Hensel with 2 gallons of white paint and we had no business spending. And Frank said, "No business spending. Are you sure about this, Meg?" And I said, "I have never been sure about anything in my life. Let's do it anyway." I thought about what we built from that morning, not just the store, the whole thing, the life, the 40 years of ordinary Tuesdays and extraordinary Christmases and hard conversations and silly arguments about nothing, and the particular way Frank laughed when something genuinely surprised him, which was not often because Frank was not easily surprised, but when it happened, it was one of the best sounds I have ever heard. And I understood something sitting there that I want to try to say as clearly as I can, because I think it is the most important thing I have learned from any of this. What Stacy tried to take was not $133,000. Money is just money. It can be recovered, it can be rebuilt. What she tried to take was the proof that the life Frank and I built together had been worth building, that the work had mattered, that the 40 years of early mornings and careful decisions and small sacrifices and enormous love had produced something real and lasting and worth protecting. She did not take that. She could not take that. No one can take that. I got my money back. I got more than my money back. But what I really got back, sitting at that table the night before the hearing, was something that had never actually been gone. I just needed to fight for it to remember it was mine. That is the real victory, not the legal one, not the financial one, the one that happens in the quiet at the kitchen table, before anyone else is awake.